It's Ken Harbaugh with the MeidasTouch Network. I started Burn the Boats because I felt like I had to do something about the growing threats our country faces, especially the danger that Trumpism imposes to the democracy I fought for as a Navy pilot. These are stressful times for all of us trying to push back against extremism. But one of the upsides is that I have met so many others in this fight who I truly respect. My guest this week is at the top of that list. Dan Barkhuff is a former Navy SEAL, now an emergency room physician, and the founder of Veterans for Responsible Leadership, which was created to give vets like us a way to stand up to demagogues like Trump. Dan put out a video during Trump's last presidential campaign in which he called him a coward. It got millions of views. I'll put a link to it down below. Dan and I have now teamed up to produce a documentary titled Against All Enemies about violent extremist groups like the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys and why they work so hard to recruit veterans into their ranks. I'll have more to say about the film in the weeks to come, but I thought I'd share one short clip before my interview with Dan. It shows a group of radicalized military vets who swore the same oath that Dan and I did, preparing to target civilians on the streets of an American city. Terrifying stuff, but Dan is fearless in calling it out. Here's the clip. My interview with Dan Barkhuff, former Navy SEAL and co-producer of Against All Enemies, is right after. Thanks.
3, 2, 1, go.
One of our guys up there is SF, Special Forces vet. We have another one that's a retired staff sergeant, SF.
I'm not surprised that extremist organizations try to recruit veterans for the credibility that we bring, but also for our commitment. And that commitment takes a lot of forms. I mean, veterans are people in our society who in many ways have said, I will do whatever is necessary to preserve what I believe in, up to and including violence.
Put a scope on there and take a peek at it, see what we got.
That's the same kind of shit that they've been doing their whole career. You know, now they're doing it here inside the United States. It's kind of a weird feeling.
Our group was the second group to enter Afghanistan.
It's so enticing. You get to fight again, you know? You're trained in certain things, you know, you can see the battlefield better. If you believe the country's under attack, you have a certain set of skills that maybe you were trained with that you can, you know, help the group around you, right? You're a force multiplier.
They're fucking coming. Then you get locked and loaded, ready to go.
Hey guys, everybody spread out, get eyes open, get a good perimeter.
They light shit on fire, we can shoot on them, right?
Yep.
They're very fucking well. Hopefully they light shit on fire.
My guest today is Dan Barkhuff, a former Navy SEAL who now serves as an emergency medicine physician. He's also the founder of Veterans for Responsible Leadership, an organization dedicated to empowering veteran voices to hold political leaders accountable. The organization began as a response to then President Trump's abuse of power, and ever since, Dan has been a leading voice in calling out such abuses wherever he finds them. Dan, welcome to Burn the Boats.
Thanks, Ken. Happy to be here, man. This will be fun.
Yeah, I probably should have mentioned that you and I have a history fighting alongside each other, calling out the frauds in our community, the veteran community, wherever we see them. I'm also on the board of VFRL, and we're both dads. We like to commiserate about the challenges and the joys of fatherhood. I understand you were on duty this morning getting your kids out through an ice storm. How'd it go?
You know, we got about 1/8 of an inch of ice, so it was one of those, and it's now changing over to snow. So this podcast is about climate change, right? That's what we're talking about.
It can be about whatever you want, but I gotta rest on your credibility a bit as a Navy SEAL knocking down doors in Iraq. Did ever you imagine back then that you would be shuffling kids through ice storms and being a political activist on the side?
I don't think any of us, figured what middle age would have in store for us, right?
No, I certainly didn't. What made you go the medical school route after being on the front lines as a Navy SEAL?
It's a good question. So the short answer is, I was mad at the Navy and wanted to get out, and do something completely different. And in hindsight, I shouldn't have been mad at the Navy, but it, had to do with orders and things like that. And I was like, I'm going to get out and do something totally different. And, I was young and single at the time. And medicine had always been something I'd sort of been interested in. The medical community, I thought, and I think I was right about, in general, a lot of the same stuff that I enjoyed about the military can be found in medicine. Obviously, the mission is entirely different, but the people that you surround yourself with in both environments is really kind of similar in a lot of ways. You're doing a quote unquote mission. You're working together. You're surrounded by people who want to be there, who self-selected to be there. No one becomes a trauma nurse by accident, right? It's something that you get to. And it's that sense of teamwork, that sense of kind of belonging. And for me, as a physician, a little bit of that sense of leadership was present in both communities. And so that's what I thought I would find and what I ended up finding.
You've extended that mission-oriented thinking to the political arena. What was the prompt for VFRL? Was there a moment when you said to yourself, we've got to stand up, we've got to organize because this commander-in-chief, President Trump, is betraying all the values that we swore to uphold?
Yeah, but you know what? What's crazy, Ken, is when I look back on it, the moment that I was like, I got to get up off the couch seems so trivial at this point after all that happened, right? Because VFRL was from 2017. And the thing that kind of inspired me to rally some folks and start working on this was the original Michael Flynn stuff, lying to the FBI about conversations with Russia and lying to the then Vice President Mike Pence. And, Michael Flynn, even more so than Trump, was kind of the thing where I was like, we got to do something. I'd always been anti-Trump. When VFRL started, I had 2 daughters, and grab them by the pussy was fresh in my mind. And but really looking back on it, I've said this before, maybe even on your podcast, like I thought Trump was going to be terrible, but he vastly exceeded the terribleness that I thought he would bring.
Why is it important that veterans in particular organize and speak up even today after the defeat of Trump in 2020?
There's a whole lot in there to unpack. So, veterans and the military in general are a respected institution, right? If you look at kind of public opinion polling, veterans are the second most respected organization behind small business owners. And, way down the bottom is Congress, right? And so they bring a credibility to anything that they attach themselves to. And I saw a lot of veterans attaching themselves to Trump. There were people who I respected, aside from Michael Flynn, who were willing to go in and serve. People like James Mattis, people like H.R. McMaster, who went in and, I get the argument that some of them made at the time, like, hey, I'm going to be the adult in the room. They're asking me to be the national security advisor. It's better me than somebody else. But many veterans were also, openly campaigning for this guy. And it seemed one-sided at the time. And there weren't a lot of voices in the veteran community who were willing to speak out. The military tends to skew conservative in general, and there's different variants amongst different parts of the military. So, Marine Corps enlisted folks were the most likely to vote for Trump. Air Force officers and naval officers were the least likely to vote for Trump. And there were sort of these, but it was relatively close. So there were people speaking out in favor of him being elected. There were SEALs speaking out in favor of him being elected. You got Marcus Luttrell speaking at a convention. You've got Dan Crenshaw speaking at a convention. And I was like, hold on a second. The guys I know don't feel this way. I don't feel this way. And so there was kind of a one-sided narrative, and VFRL was an attempt to push back on that.
As much credibility as veterans still do retain in this country, you and I are both vets who have deep misgivings about the lionization of vets. And I'm actually quoting you from one of your recent Resolute Square articles. You wrote, "The lionization of military service, the military aesthetic, and military weapons in the vacuum of civilian online existence is the most salient threat to the Republic since the Civil War." That's a pretty bold statement.
Yeah, and I think it's true. And I think it holds up. So what I see as the greatest threat to the Republic as we know it, to American democracy, is the undermining of institutions and the cynicism that so much of the populace feels, right? You know, how did Trump get elected, right? It was like drain the swamp, right? People view politics and politicians very, very negatively. And so when, you know, that what we were just talking about, right? This credibility that veterans give, you know, using that, weaponizing that, right? That got weaponized by MAGA. And they're saying, hey, look, we're good. We're the good guys. And that's a thread that you see in all, you know, fascist and neo-fascist movements throughout history. I mean, Mussolini did the same thing. The Nazis did the same thing, right? These are known playbooks. This is right out of an authoritarian playbook, which is, you know, everything martial is to be lauded. You know, it's the opposite sort of this, you know, this individualism and this conversational democracy that we ought to, that we have in America and have had for 200 years. And so when we put people who served on a pedestal, right, and we say that, hey, you know, whatever this guy says is great, you get people like, you know, you get people like Michael Flynn as a national security advisor, right? He just rode into a position, a very important position, based on credibility, which was essentially, you know, not there. And so when I talk more about the lionization of military aesthetic, the military service, but without the safeguards that the military provides, right? Like we live in a society now where I can drive. I live in Vermont, so it's about a 20-minute drive, but I can drive 20 minutes, walk into a store, walk out with an AR-15, with a high-cap mag, H-gear. I can get basically camis. I probably can pick up body armor within an hour of here. I can totally outfit myself just like I was, you know, about to kick indoors in Fallujah, minus an encrypted radio, right? That's probably the only thing I can't get. And when we have that without a commander in charge of me, a task unit commander, a JSOTF, you know, telling people where to go, without a senior enlisted saying, hey, this is a good idea, this is fucked up, and we just leave our decision making and our influences to, you know, what we see on various chat rooms or Facebook. I mean, that's a recipe for disaster.
And the ability to do that isn't just available. It's not just accessible. People are doing it. I mean, gun sales have gone through the roof. More guns were sold last year than ever before. More guns will probably be sold this year than last year. And you have tied that to this idea of, you know, twisted masculinity and the politicization of fear. It's interesting that you bring up Mussolini, because we just had Ruth Ben-Ghiat on the show who talked about the use of virility and masculinity in far-right movements to drive people, mostly young men, into the arms of these neo-fascist and fascist movements. I think you bring special credibility to this conversation as a Navy SEAL, but can you talk about real men? Because you wrote this incredible essay for Resolute Square about the perversion of this idea of masculinity, that real men are supposed to make those around them afraid.
Yeah, you know, young boys transitioning to adulthood, right? You know, I was this way growing up. I wanted to be like my dad, right? I wanted to be a man. I wanted to, chop wood with a maul, all the other, paint the house, drive a car, whatever it is, the stuff that little boys see men doing, right? And so I ascribe to that. And that doesn't go away as you move into kind of later adolescence, where all of a sudden your dad's like the biggest dork ever, and you're like, oh, I don't want to wear those jeans. Like, I look like my dad, right? So, but you still want to be a man in society. And that's a really a timeless thing. In Native American ceremonies, there's, a sweat lodge, or, you have to go and hunt and kill a wild animal, or, something like that. In European societies, in Western societies, we mark this transition from school to the workplace. You get your union card, and, you're working in the factory alongside your uncles and your dad, right? And so now that stuff, as we've transitioned to this modern economy, people are not kind of getting their masculine identity through their job, right? And that is a big change. And so I think there's this generation of folks who are kind of looking for some tribe to belong to feel like a valued part of a tribe. And that's a universal human feeling that we've all had for millennia. And, human survival is based on that, right? It's you have to be valuable to the tribe, and then therefore the tribe will value you. And so that hasn't changed. That's human nature. And what has changed is we've lost this tribe economically. Working for Uber Eats, well, maybe it pays the bills or whatever, it's not the same as, in 1920, working with your extended family in a coal mine, right? Like it's different. Some of it is a lack of kind of physical danger and doing manly jobs, right? I use air quotes, like, and so people are lost, young men are lost. And what can replace it? Well, I mean, they're buying guns and body armor. I mean, it's identical to when I was a kid. I used to wear, the Patriots quarterback's, jersey, right? I'm a 10-year-old boy. And so they're doing the same thing. It's not a football jersey. Instead, it's body armor.
Do you think the Josh Hawleys and Ted Cruzes of the world, they almost all fall on the far right of the political spectrum, are aware of their cynicism, or are they projecting? I just think it's funny that the least, and I'll use the air quotes too, the least manly politicians out there are the ones writing books about manliness, or in Cruz's case, lionizing Russian military recruiting ads while mocking American military recruiting ads. I mean, these are not guys I would want my kids, my sons or daughters, looking up to in any way.
I think it's disingenuous, right? Like, politicians are, they're good at sniffing out what works, right? And so, I don't know how many downloads Josh Hawley gets, but, I'd imagine he's going to keep doing it as long as he gets a fair number of it, right? And so it goes back to this, sort of search for meaning, I think. And we used to, as men have pretty clear roles, and I don't mourn the loss of that. That don't take that the wrong way. I'm not saying that, it was better then or anything of the sort, but, it was sort of more clearly defined. And, now I work in a job I love, a job that there's a lot of meaning that I attach to it, and it's mostly women. And folks are having a hard time with that, or finding meaning. They're trying to find meaning, right? Like that's the guy that I would aspire to be like as a leader would be someone like Ernest Shackleton, right? Who, have you read Endurance?
I have.
Yeah,
I have that quote. So I used to have it up on my wall, the request for applications to join his expedition.
Yeah. Yeah. So, for any listener who might not know, I mean, great book, old book, Endurance. It's about Ernest Shackleton, who's this British explorer. He's in his early 40s. He's trying to get to the South Pole. And his ship gets wrecked in the Antarctic ice, and they're stranded, and they're facing an Antarctic winter, which summertime up here. And they are, one could very easily imagine, oneself panicking in such a situation. And it's a textbook of leadership and a textbook of meaning. One of the coolest, things, and I think it speaks directly to this point, is, Shackleton there was this one guy on the crew who was, kind of cynical, and he was like, we're all going to die. Like, this sucks. And, this is a bad spot. And he was worried that, this is the person who's going to, his morale is going to kind of poison the whole expedition. And we're going to have people who are, all of a sudden not, their morale is going to plummet, and that's going to lead to a bad outcome. So Shackleton takes the guy and was like, hey, you're rooming with me. They had like 2-man tents, and he's like, you're my roommate. And so, he basically kept an eye on him and made sure that he had something to do, right? He had a job to do. He would go out in the morning and, take the temperature and that sort of thing. And he made sure that this guy felt valued and felt important. And as a result, that the morale of the expedition did not plummet. And in fact, they survived. They all survived this winter in Antarctica. And it's that need for value that I think is missing from the equation, right? It's this need to contribute. And I think we ask too little of, young men.
Should we bring back the draft?
No. So, yeah. So, I love thinking about that, right? Like, it's different in the piece I wrote when we chatted about that. The draft, we went away from the draft for economic reasons. And primarily we drafted people because they were like, it's prohibitively expensive to pay these guys enough to go to Vietnam and, hump around a rice paddy. And same thing in World War II. And we don't need that, right? Like we make our recruiting goals. No one would argue, no one would stand for a draft. I think that is an exercise in kind of intellectualizing, but the draft had an effect on the society that it served, aside from just military preparedness. So because of a draft, you took people from all over the country and, you put them together in a military unit, and they worked towards, a common goal. They deployed together. They learned things about other parts of the country, other segments of society. And the shine was off of military service, right? The reason you didn't have Vietnam vets parading around in old school H gear with, M14s in the 70s and 80s is because that doesn't sit, it's like, I did that, been there, done that. I don't need to march around and sort of fantasize about violence. I know what that looks like. And we don't have that anymore. So, it's a better question would be, what do we ask of these, young men, and they're largely all men who are coming into adulthood. Like, what do we ask of them? Because I don't think the way to get the best United States of America is to ask nothing of them.
Do you have an answer to that question. Is there something short of military service? Because I'm with you 100%. There are myriad reasons not to bring back the draft. But is there something which can stand in its place to create that sense of community and responsibility to something greater than oneself? And I think most importantly, a sense of a common purpose as a country. What defines us is what we're working towards, not how different we are from each other.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is not now, right? Like, not as it exists now, right? So, there's every 10 years or so, someone calls for like national service, and I don't know if that's the answer, right? Like, there have been attempts in American history, aside from the military, to do that. I mean, in the Great Depression, right, you've got like the Civil Conservation Corps and, things like this. The Tennessee River Valley Authority, we had a way of, and those were largely employment programs, right? But they also had a similar effect of kind of bringing people together and giving them a purpose. So I don't know that the answer is a big government program, right? Maybe it's not. Maybe it's, you can find meaning through a lot of different things, but a life without meaning, a life of, relative privilege, a life of relative safety, a life of relative selfishness is not the answer. I mean, it makes people miserable. This is, every study that's ever been done on this topic, it shows that if you don't feel valued, you feel depressed and anxious and miserable. I mean, this is a known medical fact. I'll give you a brief example that, in the emergency department, we often deal with folks who are in a mental health crisis. And, there are folks who are, having suicidal thoughts, or maybe they had a suicide attempt or something like that. And, if you, something I'll tell the med students or the residents, if you come into me and, you say, you're going to kill yourself if, you don't get into, your favorite college or whatever, or you don't get a car for your birthday or something like that, you're not going to kill yourself. That's borne out by evidence. It's called conditional suicidality, and it doesn't lead to suicide. If you come in, and you're a 60-year-old male who's got a firearm at home, who is feeling depressed and doesn't have a family and feels alone and feels like they're not contributing anything to anyone, you're at like the most highest risk. Those are the people who complete suicides, right? Are people who are middle-aged and lost. And so this, has, Sebastian Younger, a mutual friend of ours, he talks at length about this, so yeah. It's finding value and finding meaning in service to others. Whether it's, hey, I've got to keep it together because, my grandma lives with me and she's got a bad hip and I take care of her, right? That's one way to find meaning. As much as I, rip on folks like Jocko, if your meaning in life is to get a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, sure, go for it. If your meaning in life is, hey, I'm the crossing guard at a kid's elementary school, and, I make sure the kids don't get hit by a bus, right? Everyone can contribute. It's a fallacy that no one can contribute to other people. And so service gives people self-worth. It gives people, it gives people a positive outlook.
I've always found composting to be too inconvenient and too messy to stick with. But then I got a Lomi. Lomi allows me to turn all of my food scraps into dirt with the push of a button. Lomi is a countertop electric composter that turns scraps to dirt in under 4 hours. There's no smell when it runs, and it's really quiet. And thanks to Lomi, I have way less garbage each week. And our family garden is now filled with dirt made from kitchen scraps. Since I got my Lomi, I throw out way less garbage. That means it's not going to landfills and producing methane. Instead, I turn that waste into nutrient-rich dirt that I can feed to my plants. It feels great knowing that I'm composting and creating something useful, soil, instead of adding to landfill waste. I have a basically limitless supply of dirt for my garden. The other week we had in-laws over for my daughter's birthday party, and the food cleanup was a breeze. If you want to start making a positive environmental impact or just make cleanup after dinner that much easier, Lomi is the answer. Head to lomi.com/boats and use the promo code BOATS to get $50 off your Lomi. That's $50 off when you head to lomi.com/boats and use promo code BOATS at checkout. Food waste is gross. Let Lomi save you the hassle of a cold trip out to the garbage can while filling your garden and doing right by the planet. So many of our fellow veterans, though, have found that sense of value and meaning and this perverted idea of service from joining organizations like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. I bet if you talk to, and friends of ours have done this, the majority of the insurrectionists on January 6th, even the veterans among them, or especially the veterans among them, thought at the time that they were the ones fighting for the Constitution. How do you make that distinction? How do you educate people about the noble forms of service and the ones that are really being manipulated by the Ted Cruz's and Josh Hawleys of the world?
It's hard. It's really, really hard. I mean, this shit is baked into our DNA as a nation, right? Like, you know, what do you learn about when you learn about the American Revolution? You learn about like the Sons of Liberty, right? And, you know, it's a big problem. And, you know, having people who find meaning and find their purpose by literally plotting to, you know, kidnap and execute elected officials, or plotting to start a civil war on the steps of the Capitol, who genuinely believe that they're doing the right thing, is a tough nut to crack, right? So, I mean, it's funny, I was talking to Chris Goldsmith the other day, and you know Chris, and Chris has done kind of a lot of work sort of in this space, and he's talking about, you know, I kind of was like, you know, how many of these people are salvageable? And he didn't really have a good answer, but he was like, I mean, some, right? But some of them just like to hurt people, right? And we all know people like that. We all know people who just like to hurt people. I've seen them everywhere in my life. They were in elementary school. They were in high school. They were in the military. They were in the SEAL teams. I've seen it in medicine. I've seen it. Everyone can think of someone who just, you know, they just want to hurt other people. They're just assholes. And so these neo-fascist movements, things like Patriot Front, things like the Oath Keepers, the Three Percenters, you know, the Proud Boys, right? A certain percentage of them are just assholes who like to hurt other people. And yeah, maybe there's a few people who, you know, through literal rehabilitation could be, you know, contributing members of society, but it's pretty tough to think you're going to salvage someone who is willing to sit in the back of the U-Haul and drive 12 hours to Philadelphia to beat up black people, right? So it's bananas. I mean, it's really, really hard.
What's uniquely American about our population of assholes, as you describe them, though, is the ubiquity of guns.
Yep.
And there's this other quote that I'm drawn to from a recent essay of yours in Resolute Square about, you know, just how cheap and easy it is to substitute the firearm for all the military experience and training that you get when you've actually been downrange, actually seen what war looks like. And your quote, I think it's great, is this: the military aesthetic carried an insidious component, never overtly stated, but ultimately ready to seep out into the world. Warriors need enemies. For actual operators, these were provided as part of the deal. Transnational terrorists intent on destabilizing allied governments in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. But you have this what feels like an entire generation of young people, mostly men, who are looking for enemies to provide that sense of purpose and camaraderie.
Yeah, it's easy to, this whole thing about the warrior mindset, right? Like, all this stuff, which I think is a bunch of hogwash, really. I'm interested in being the best citizen I can be. An aspect of that has included, in my younger days, being part of a military unit. The way in which you can feel manly by picking up a weapon of war has been around forever, right? There's this, have you ever read The Fall of Berlin by Anthony Beevor?
I haven't.
So, it's a great book. He's this British historian, it goes through kind of the fall of Berlin in World War II, and a lot of kind of interesting accounts from the Red Army folks who's ultimately like stormed the Reichstag and stuff like this. And there's this one Russian, lieutenant who the day after the surrender, right, there's no more gunfire, and there's two little German boys playing, swords with like a wooden sword, they're just fencing, and it's in our nature, right? And so if you can't channel it appropriately, it's just deep pathology. The people who think that all there was to being in the military was, putting on some body armor, getting a cool gun, and then kind of patrolling along the street with your friends, it's just so far from, think of how we're like indoctrinated into the military, right? Like you go to boot camp or you go to OCS or whatever, and it's weeks, right? It's weeks before you touch a gun at all. And then when you finally take it out of the armory, they put the fear of God into you, and, you march to the range and you get like one round and you shoot your first bullet ever, and then you have to clear and safe your rifle, and there's some scary drill sergeant kind of, looking over your shoulder, like literally right behind you. And every time you check out a weapon in the military, even in the SEAL teams, you check out a weapon, it's like, there's somebody else there, there's two-person integrity, you're going to an organized range, nobody like in the military checks out like an AT-4 and just rolls around with it in case they need it. It's insane to think that this is, what we do in the military. It's not at all. It's not even close to what we do in the military. So it's really just this facile worship of a weapon of war in an attempt to feel manly. And it's rooted in ignorance, and it's led to, it continues to lead daily to disastrous consequences.
Yeah, I would argue it's rooted in insecurity as well. The idea that carrying an AR-15 makes you a bigger or a braver person actually signals to anyone who's done that in a war zone the exact opposite. And it doesn't make you feel more free. You've written about this as well. If you're a responsible gun owner, it's a responsibility. It is a burden. Can you talk about the freedom costs of being a responsible gun owner, especially as a veteran?
Yeah, exactly. Even in the, very kind of simplistic, like day-to-day sense, carrying a gun around with you is, that is what you're doing, right? Like if you have a gun on your hip, if you're wearing a CQB sling with a AR, over your shoulder, that is what you're doing, right? Like you're not, stopping to wrestle with your kid in the living room, right? Like you're not, going, picking up groceries at the grocery store. You're carrying a weapon, and that your entire being while you have that weapon on is you're looking for threats, right? You're like it's this mindset of, well, if I have a gun, then I'm good to go. And, if something bad happens, I'll be ready. And it's like, well, the very, very rare instances where, and they're exceedingly rare, where, something quote unquote bad is going to happen and you're going to stop it with a firearm, is, let's call it like 1/10 of 1% of the time, which is a gross over exaggeration, right? Like most of the time, you're going to be walking around in a peaceful population. You're going to be at the shopping mall. You're going to be at the grocery store, your kid's little league game. And it limits you in what you can do if you know what you're doing with a firearm, right? Like you can't take it off. You can't leave it in the car so you can just, zip into the gym, right? Like you can't, there are places you literally can't go, right? Like you can't carry it in a federal office building or something like that. It's incredibly cumbersome. Ask anyone who's been overseas, what's the best thing about coming home? It's like turning in the weapons at the armory and then all of a sudden you're free again. So it's this literal lie that's been told to gun owners that, having this firearm makes you free. It doesn't make you free. It makes you responsible all the time for, potentially ending someone's life.
Yeah, or not. I mean, the prevalence of irresponsible gun owners is borne out in just the number of senseless murders from things like fender benders and arguments in parking lots. And to me, it's as much about the mindset shift that carrying a gun forces on you as it is the additional responsibility. I wrote this piece a while back that included a reference to this scale of alertness. And, it starts with being in the green where you're enjoying life and not worried about much. And the advice to gun owners was live in the yellow, always wondering if that person approaching you on a sidewalk might be a threat. And you, I think, articulate it better than I ever could in this quote in your piece. You talk about the power of being able to, on a moment's notice, kill your fellow citizens demands complete and total respect at all times. It demands concentrations. It demands you view every person you see with that gun on your hip as a potential threat, and that's not freedom.
Yeah, it's not. Like I don't want to go to my kid's little league game and be like, I might have to kill all these people. And that's an insane way to live. It's not freedom. It's the opposite of freedom. It's putting, having the most, the top of the pyramid of your attention is, carrying around a lethal weapon. It doesn't make sense to me.
What do we do at this point? This is American exceptionalism run amok. We've got 400 million guns out there now. What do you say as a Navy SEAL who's deployed to theaters of war multiple times to the people who say the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun?
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, that's demonstrably untrue. If you look at FBI statistics, there were a few years back, I sat on a panel for violence, in community violence in Vermont. And we got some interesting stats from the FBI that, just showed that the number of active shooter situations in which they're stopped by, the good guy with the gun, is tiny, less than 5%. Most often these mass shooters, end up killing themselves. Second most often is they're killed by the police. Way down the list is, in fact, I think it's like single digits, that an active shooter has been taken down by, another citizen with a firearm. So,
and the cost of that, of course, is so many guns out there carried by people who think they're going to be the hero end up killing innocent people. Right.
And, it plays into this like American fantasy. Well, I can only speak for America. I can't, because we are American, but, think of how much of our sort of the canon of our artwork is related to like justifiable violence, right? Like, you know, you've got Liam Neeson, who's like 900 years old, and every 6 months he releases a new movie where his daughter gets kidnapped, and it's like, you know, grosses 200 million at the box office. And we have this sort of, I mean, it's a fantasy. It's this fantasy of justified violence. Like that's as American as apple pie, is that someone's going to do something bad, and, you know, I'm going to be able to do something violent and harmful to this person. And I don't know if that exists in other countries or if it's kind of unique to us, but it's undoubtedly kind of part of our canon of, you know, and you see it everywhere. So what should we do, right? So I think it starts with some common sense, some common sense changes, right? I don't think you should get a gun when you're 18. I mean, I think you should get a gun, you know, if you're going to buy a gun, I think you should be 21, right? Many of these people who go back and shoot up their high school are in that 18 to 21 year old range. You know, people make the argument that, oh, you can be 18 and serve in the military. Yeah, you can. It's a bunch of bullshit. It's like, yeah, you can be 18 and serve in the military, where you have a sergeant who's done 2 tours in Iraq, staring over your shoulder, making sure your chamber's empty before you clean it, right? So the argument that, you know, you're 18, you should be able to buy a gun, that doesn't hold water with me. So that's what I would do. I would raise, you know, for starters, I think you have to be 21 to own a firearm. Now, do we need these military weapons of war in our streets? No, we don't. If you can't ban them, then, you know, we had an assault weapons ban in this country for years. If you can't ban them, then I think, you know, there needs to be training for them. I think you know, and I think we can put pressure on, you know, if we can't pass these laws, I think we can put pressure on the people selling the guns, right? Can you sue you know, if your husband walks into a gun store, buys a 9mm and blows his head off, can you sue the person who, you know, sold him that gun? I mean, as it stands right now, you can't, right? In most jurisdictions. So I think that there's, you know, there's sort of low hanging fruit in this, but I think it's incumbent upon us as we go through middle age to raise the next generation better. I think some of it they're figuring out on their own. If you look at Gen Z polls about, you know, about guns and, you know, the generation that's most impacted by these school shootings, they feel very differently than your 55-year-old white male.
Yeah. I just did scholarship interviews for, you know, a pretty elite scholarship. And when I got to my second kid, I'm going to get choked up saying this. When I got to the second kid who had been affected by a mass shooting in their community, I just lost it. You're right. A lot of the mess we've created, they're going to have to clean up. Last question, Dan. Yeah. When are you coming back on Twitter? It's not the same there without you.
Twitter was, did you ever meet Mike Madrid?
No.
So Mike was, he's like a former, you know, a never Trump Republican guy. And he tweeted, this is why I left Twitter. Okay. I left Twitter because Madrid tweeted, hey, all you people who, you know, are staying on Twitter now that Elon took it and are, you know, you're in it for the likes and, you know, you've built up this following and all this kind of stuff. You're doing the same thing the Republicans did. You're doing the same thing Josh Hawley did. And I was like, you know what? He's right, man. So, you know, I'm not in a rush to get back on Twitter. I've been reading more books, Ken. So, you know, things are good in that sense. But, yeah, you know, never say never, but I'm not missing Twitter right now.
Well, you're a better man than I, Dan Barkhuff, but I think most people know that. I did check though, your video, just sticking it to Trump has 7.5 million views. So it keeps ratcheting up. I think we'll post that in the show notes. It's been great talking to you.
Thanks, Ken. I appreciate it, man.
Our blue wall stopped the red wave and election deniers got denied election. That's why we're celebrating with the new Democracy Prevails tee. We've got lots of work to do, but we should all be proud that when democracy was tested, democracy prevailed. You've earned this. Don't wait. Get yours right now at store.MeidasTouch.com. That's store.MeidasTouch.com.